I had this old client who, you know, he was on high blood pressure medication. He was on cholesterol medication. He had a, you know, a rather thriving business, and he tried to train really hard, but because he was so stressed and he let himself be in such a stressful state, and he kind of wore that grind more, stress more mentality as a badge of honor, right? He would not be able to, like, we would train frequently and his body just would not adapt to the stimulus.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Fueling Fire podcast with All Terrain Fitness. Our own sound effects. I'm Coach Hailey, also here with the one and only Coach Garry.
Dubbs, what it do?
And we are going to talk about one of, I don't really know if we can really say my favorite thing, because it's not necessarily a good thing, but we're going to talk all
Maybe
about...
the thing you struggle with the most?
Yes, the thing I struggle with the most. Although, you know what? We've grown. Stress. We always hear that stress is the biggest killer, the number one killer. And a lot of times we throw around the idea that stress is also going to impact weight loss along with all of the other things in our life. But we don't really understand why. We kind of know that there is a correlation, and we get a little bit confused on understanding the why. And if we don't know the why, we don't really know what to do about it.
I'm excited to learn more today.
This is also something that I don't think Garry feels ever in his body. And
what is stress?
And that's one of the things we're gonna dive deeper into it too, is just stress is so different for different people. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we notice between you and I is, you know, what is really, really stressful for me may be super duper exciting for someone else or not cause anyone else stress. And really realizing that it's an individualized thing, and it can actually be not fixed, but we can do something about it.
Well, what are we going to do?
Well, first we have to talk about why. So one of the biggest factors that stress is going to play a part is really understanding that there's different types of stress. So I like to really think of it in 3 different categories, basically having good stress, acute stress, and chronic stress. And what we're kind of going to focus on in most of the episode is talking about the chronic stress and knowing and understanding that what creates chronic stress for one person may be acute stress for someone else, maybe good stress for someone else. And that is a really, really important distinction, because a lot of times we get stuck in the comparison trap of, you know, well, this same thing happened to someone else and they don't feel that same way, so I don't really understand why it's impacting or affecting me. So one of the cool things is stress is actually good for you, and there are good types of stress. And actually right before this, we were talking about one of them, which is the feeling of adrenaline dumping. So can you think of any other kind of examples of when stress would be good for you?
What do you mean by the adrenaline dumping?
Like, you get that same stress response in your body, like you start to feel kind of anxious, your heart rate goes up, your fingers get sweaty, you're like, oh my God, I'm a little scared. But you know, like, something good is happening. So in the adrenaline
preparation,
yeah, it's
like you're nervous
excited
about something that's going to happen, but you know it's a good thing still.
Right, but you
like
have
when
that
I have my nervous tinkles before we record the podcast.
Or like before a big workout. I feel like that always happens.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, good types of stress, adrenaline dumping. For me, it's a artificial stress of weightlifting and pumping myself up sometimes and creating that stress that my body has to adapt to, right? That, you know, being able to elicit more of a need to adapt to this by heightening my, you know, awakeness, my alertness with music and maybe some, you know, pre-workout stuff to help kind of get my body ready, mentally ready to press it a little bit harder, right? So it's kind of like that whole encompassing of like preparing my body for the stress, optimizing myself to elicit a greater level of stress and have more central nervous system drive so I can get to a position where I challenge the system more with good stress for it to adapt.
Well, I think you touch on something really important, that stress has such this negative connotation. And a lot of the things you're talking about right there is like your body has these natural reactions and responses to stress to do those physical things like increase your heart rate, pump that adrenaline, get you ready for survival. Like there's a reason that's happening, and understanding that when your body does that, that's great. It's supposed to. It's actually listening to its body's cues. It's when it kind of gets out of whack that's when we have to do something about it. So, a lot of other types of good stress are like trying something new, growing. We talk about this with our athletes a lot, that almost feeling of like, I'm nervous, excited, those butterflies in your stomach, because you know that growth is going to lead to more happiness, and that stress is going to lead to better, greater things.
Yeah. And this is something that we, a lot of people in our generation and our age tend to shy away from.
Ooh.
Right? Like we tend to, especially even, my little sister, she's 10 years behind me. So what am I? I'm about to be 31. She's 21, right? Her generation and herself, right? Her journey right now, she's going through all of this, right? Like, is the fear of what might happen greater than me first even taking the action, right? Is me picturing the fear preventing me from doing what would be a good stress, which would be a good stressor of like having those nerves, those butterflies prior to the event, getting on the other side of it, having an accomplishment, and having this nice positive feedback loop. Kind of similar to like when I would be for track, right?
Yeah.
I'd line up the line for 800 meters. I knew how much pain was about to endure, but then
makes me nauseous just thinking about
hands are sweating, and you get to the other side of it and you're like, holy shit, I did well. You feel good. It's an accomplishment. You had this pain, and that stressor, right? The stress of prior to, pre-race, during race, post-race, all this kind of this having this body amp up for something and then have it be met with a positive feedback loop.
When I think so, this is one of the ways that we can channel stress is a good thing. And I think it's a good comparison of, utilizing your sister as an example or myself as an example, where, we kind of look at that stress as almost like anxiety provoking and nerves, and not necessarily the good nerves, where while you with track and everything, it's like, I know you're conditioned at the end, like, oh, I had this positive result, this positive outcome. And one of the biggest ways that we can shift our stress response to things is the way we view things. And, we always hear the importance of a positive outlook on life, but really just reframing and reshaping the way that we're thinking about situations is going to reframe and rethink our body's response to stress. So like for you, you're looking at those new kind of opportunities as opportunities and challenges for your body to overcome. When other people are really looking at that new thing as a threat. It's like, this is a threat to my comfort. This is a threat to stability. This is
my self-esteem. I might fail.
Right. And so I think that's going to be the biggest way. I'm not going to say it's the easiest way, and it's definitely a process that we have to come through, but really knowing and understanding that in these stressful times and situations, that really reframing and rethinking, this isn't necessarily a threat. So my body doesn't need to go into the same stress response as it would as like fight, flight, or freeze. But I need to look at it as a challenge that my body needs to create the stress response similar to you were talking about, of like increase my heart rate, give me adrenaline to kind of push me through this moment instead of paralyze me to not complete the moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's what we always talk about with all terrain, right? It's you have to elicit a big enough stress response for your training to elicit any adaptation, to elicit any growth, any change into where you want to go, right? That's the nature of the beast, right? Is always needing to, the body adapts to what you are stressing it with. Yeah. And there is good stress, and there's a certain level, and there's also an uncertain, not good level, right? There's that level when you're the CrossFitter who's hitting maximal heart rate all the time, every day, and signaling these adrenal responses to a point that they could be detrimental, right? There's
Yeah.
pretty clear literature on lots of forms of fitness that like too far can be not such an optimal thing for health and longevity. It might be great for that sport, might be great for that performance, but not necessarily for your longevity, right? So it's the same thing, and too much of a good thing can lead to not a good thing, but we still have to not be couch potato, which we all know, right? And have no stress adaptation going on. So we do need some type of stress.
Well, I'm gonna pick that apart a little bit, because I think this is the why that we need to understand a lot more. You keep throwing around like, our adrenal response, there can be too much of a good thing. Knowing and understanding, yes, stress is good for us, but it's when we start talking about when we're in that state of stress too often, that's when it starts to be detrimental to the body. And knowing and understand why that happens has a lot to do with our hormones. So one of the biggest things that I feel like is a little more of a well-known fact is that cortisol is our stress hormone. There's also going to be a lot of other things going into play, and you just mentioned your adrenals. So I would be interested if you could just explain a little more of like what is physically happening within our body when that stress response is happening, and when is it too much, or why does it become too much?
Yeah. So the big thing, the way I view it is, how should I say view it? Right. We have this. Maybe? Yeah. Well, so we have this, we have to have cortisol, right? If we don't have cortisol, we're going to die. It helps regulate blood pressure and heart and everything. So that stress hormone that everyone likes to kind of,
put a negative spin on.
Yeah.
It's like your body is working if it creates cortisol.
Right. And so, we obviously need to elicit a certain amount, and it's just like anything, an animal, animal's always a good one to think about. Like you can think of an animal that's just, let's say an animal that's been malnourished, had to fight a lot, has to under a severe amount of stress, habitat's getting destroyed, right?
Right.
There's this level where you're eliciting such a stress response, right, that you're never really getting into that deep rest and rejuvenation, right? So there's that point of like, I've been guilty of this myself, like training 2 days, 3 days, thinking like I need to do this amount to compete at this level because this is what these other people are doing, right? And at that point, like I'm tired and lethargic and have no motivation to do other things in my life because I'm eliciting that stress response so much, right? Yeah. So, you can be overdoing it to the point that you don't get into that rest and rejuvenation, especially if you combine that with like under eating, and then you're not getting into that position where you also want to get the healing and repairing from that stress response, right? That stressful moment, the stressor that you put the body into, right? So we want to, the cortisol and testosterone run on that same axis, whereas like one is up, the other one tends to be down, right? So we want to, allow ourselves to get out of that position, and also understanding how to actively get into that deeper restful state, which I'm sure we'll talk about, so you can kind of start to trigger getting into a rest and rejuvenation state faster, so you're not spending as much time in this revved up position. Is that a good way to answer your question?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the big difference when we're talking about acute stress and chronic stress, and really we keep saying the word stress response. And one of the biggest things I think to kind of make it more visualized, at least in my brain, is really looking at as a stress cycle. Stress is going to happen, and all of those things need to happen in our body, but we need to kind of close the ring almost. And that we have this stress response, and when we just leave it open and it's open-ended and the cortisol is still flowing and being pumped out in our body, it doesn't have the signal to turn off, close the cycle has finished. That's when the acute stress, where it would be like, okay, I had the stress response, I needed to get out of this situation, I figured it out. Now,
and when you say closing, you mean like actively taking yourself out of that stressful position?
Yes. Or being able to restore your body's natural balanced state of hormones. Like you were just saying, when cortisol up, testosterone is down, understanding that there's a balance that our hormones need to have within our body to create homeostasis, and knowing that when we have that increased cortisol response, that's a good thing, but we also need to have something to bring it back down. We can't stay in that heightened state because that's when we bleed into chronic stress, and we'll talk about how that's when it starts to impact weight loss, progress, everything there.
Boom.
Is there anything else you wanted to add there?
I think that was good.
Cool. But what I was going to say is when you look at it in more of a cycle, you can understand that the quote unquote healthy way to have stress is to, be able to handle it, close it, move on. It's chronic stress that's when you really start to see it impacting the body. And one of the biggest ways that it's going to do that initially is to start impacting your decisions. What?
Done.
And I think our athletes come into our atmosphere all the time. And I would say it's at the beginning of when they come in and even halfway through of whenever we have calls with them, they go through a period of doing really, really well for a bit of time. Like they get in a routine, they get in a habit. They're like, I'm crushing it. Life is good. It's really easy to hit my goals. I'm hitting my nutrition. I'm being able to move. And then something happens. There's some sort of stress that kind of comes into their life. And they're like, now, I just all of a sudden I started binging. I just went and sat on the couch forever. I didn't do my workout. I just went out to dinner and had pizza and beer and wings and couldn't do anything else. And it's knowing and understanding that your body is actually going into protective mode when that stressful state occurs and is inhibiting you to make those quote unquote good decisions. So knowing and understanding that your body goes into default mode when you're going into either acute or chronic versions of stress, because like we were saying with, animals in survival mode, it's kind of like, this is the thing I need to do. I need to put all of my focus and energy and attention to make sure that my body is safe in this situation. And I can't spend extra energy doing these other things you want me to do. So it's really going to stick with our decision-making is made in the prefrontal cortex. That's why we make stupid choices when we're teenagers, because that is still developing. But that's what's happening also with our decision-making for good, healthy, quote-unquote, healthy options, is that when we're stressed, the prefrontal cortex starts to not diminish its functioning, but really power off its resources to other parts of your body, knowing it needs to get you through those stressful situations, and goes into default mode for decisions. So when you are kind of new at making healthier choices, your body's going to default to those old habits. Mm-hmm. And it's when this is the power of consistency that comes up over and over again. When you are more frequently making those good choices, it's creating a habit in your own default mode so that when you do hit those stressful times, you don't even have to think about it. So when your body turns off of that conscious decision-making and goes into unconscious decision-making, it goes to those easier decisions.
Yeah. So it's kind of like pulling back the layers of an onion, right? Your body's focusing on the perimeter that's saying stress, like here's the stressful situation, this stressful event,
right,
this stressful thing that's happening to me physically, mm-hmm, right? So I don't have time to prioritize these other things, or, whether it be make the correct decision or also getting into a rest and rejuvenation state. Like I still have to tackle this thing, right? Like I have to make sure. It's kind of like if you're, you have a house that's getting a flood, right? And you're stuck in just continually putting down the sandbags and you never get the time to actually repair, right? Like your body is always kind of prioritizing putting down sandbags over and over and over. But the structure is still getting demolished on underneath, right? Like that's kind of that onion layer effect of like what your body's prioritizing. It's like, we got to go and prioritize threat numero uno. Mm-hmm. And then we can think about doing some of the other things once that's accomplished.
Right. And that's a survival tactic. It's basically just reallocating its resources of like, I need to focus on this. We can deal with those other things later. So that's why, just like you were saying, that rest and rejuvenation that we'll go into a little bit is going to be key, because that's when we're going to rebuild all of those things. And then you can focus on those other goals. It's not like, oh, okay, if you're stressed, you can't make progress. It's just understanding how to manage that stress to be better. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So decision-making is going to be huge. When we're stressed, our decision-making capabilities are diminished. So when we make it easier with our environment, and just creating habits that we've done consistently, that's when we can kind of default to those better decisions. So decision making is going to be one. Cortisol, though, is going to impact the body in a lot of other physical ways, in increasing our appetite, increasing our cravings for fats and sugars, the way we store fat. So I don't know if you want to dive a little deeper onto kind of a little more nitty gritty on the details of what cortisol really does when we're in that stressful state and why we may see that impact either a stall in our weight or an actual increase in weight.
Yeah. So are we talking more acute or are we talking chronic?
Chronic.
Yeah. So, I can use a few examples, but, what to paint a picture is, when we are eliciting that stress response, we're eliciting adrenaline, cortisol's rising, right? Our body is getting into a preparation mode to fight, flight, or freeze. And so then we get to to do that, right? We might need to, sprint really fast for our survival. We might need to go fight the tiger for a bout of survival, right? And in that moment, our body's preparing us for that, right? It's increasing blood pressure. It's increasing our blood sugar. So we have, right, the vasodilation, blood is flowing, it's pumping, it's getting more ready, increasing that pressure, more blood per stroke volume, so on and so forth. And then it's also raising that blood sugar so you have more instant energy to pull upon, right? Like when we are doing something that's like maximal effort for 2-3 minutes, right? Fight or flight, fight to the death type thing. We are utilizing internal energy storages, right? We're not really utilizing oxygen. In that moment, we're using all carbohydrates. So our body is getting to this position where it's ramping everything up to get ready for that flight or flight. And doing that is, again, the blood pressure, the high blood sugar. But as we tend to get into more chronic stress matched with unhealthy habits and continually already having higher blood sugar, already having higher lipids, right? The body, when we start getting into a chronic stress, combining those things two together, right? It's not, your heart and the pliability of the arteries and such are getting less capable of handling that quick bout of high blood pressure, that quick bout of adrenaline. And so, to paint an example, right? I had this old client who, he was on high blood pressure medication. He was on cholesterol medication. He had a rather thriving business, and he tried to train really hard, but because he was so stressed and he let himself be in such a stressful state, and he kind of wore that grind more, stress more mentality as a badge of honor, right? He would not be able to, we would train frequently and his body just would not adapt to the stimulus, right? It would be like we were hitting our heads against a brick wall continuously because he was always in a chronic state of stress to the point where he'd be clenching the sheets. He'd be grinding his teeth in the middle of the night. He'd be sleeping and dreaming about the thing that he's stressing out, right? So even in his state of sleep, it's like that stressed out animal, right? Where it's like, you're just never even getting out of this. Even in your sleep, it's not, your sleep restfulness is up here when it needs to be down here if you actually even want to get to a place of adapting to that stimuli, right? So, somebody who's living in this chronic state, and then you go and even get this little extra bout from exercise, right? Your body's over here prioritizing this graver threat all the time. That it's like, cool, I don't know what that was. It was just another addition to all the other stress that's going on. So what are we like? We just need to get out away from threat, right? Like your body's trying to run, telling you get away from threat, right? We get to the point it's just chronic all the time, right? And so he had, a part where the business had a very unfortunate event, and that made things spiral even more out of control to the point where, breathing would be labored. I'm like, well, how is your breathing labored when we've been working out 6 days a week? We're doing everything. And it's like, yeah, you're just not you're so stressed out everywhere.
Well, and I think it's super important. You touched on two things that I feel like show up a lot right now with just a lot of people I know personally and a lot of athletes that have come into our sphere or have, wanted to work with us. And you touched on with the grind more, do more mentality. That is, and wearing it as a badge of honor. That is so huge on like, well, I'm doing more than the person next to me. And I feel like just the comparison of like, well,
more's not always better.
I grind harder. I work harder. And I mean, the amount of people are like, yeah, I only get 4 hours of sleep a night. I'm like, I don't really know why you're like touting that around. Like, that's really fucking cool. Like, that's not great. And I think it's especially important for people that are more in our age bracket as well, of kind of, you know, we have that bulletproof mentality of like, yeah, well, I don't have any of those things now. And I think you touched on it a lot of like, well, when it's kind of more in that acute phase, we have that increased blood pressure and things like that. But if it lasts on and on for years, decades, that's when you start to get into those more fearful responses. And I think sometimes people don't understand how bad it can be.
It's like a pebble in your shoe, right? It's like you're walking, you do 1 mile with the pebble, it doesn't do anything to you in that mile, but then you go 5 miles, 10 miles, it starts to break the skin, right? So you're eliciting this stress response elsewhere, but you're staying in this chronic state that like you're not getting that chance to repair and heal and strengthen from that stress stimuli, right? You are just continually like, maybe I'm doing a sprint. I'm walking 20 miles with the pebble in my shoe, and I maybe sprint like a half a mile, but then I keep walking with the pebble in my shoe, and I never just stop to pull the pebble out and let it heal. Yeah.
And I think and we've touched on rest, rejuvenation, and we usually get the opposite of, and you mentioned exercise especially, and I think I get this, you may get it from men as well too, but I get it a lot from women of like, you know, exercise is my stress relief, and that's great. We're also here for it. We understand that. But then we also get, well, I'm super, super stressed out and I'm not hitting my goals. So the only thing I can think to do is exercise more, exercise harder, start doing the 2-a-days, start doing the 3-a-days, start eating less. And really, like, they just don't understand how
we see
detrimental it can be.
Right? And especially our cardio queen ladies out there. I hate to say it. You're the person I think of immediately, right?
Yeah.
Seeing this, mom who takes on all the stress of being mom, also who wants to be a go-getter in her career, who also wants to live up to the perceived societal norms of Instagram and body composition.
Got to do it all, ladies.
And then seeing them work out all the time and thinking that they got to go and do 2-a-days and somehow manage all those things. Right. In reality, it's like, hey, if you could actually do less and focus more on recovery and de-stressing, you'll actually get more from that adaptation that you were doing less of. Right. You'll allow the body to be like, hey, wow, this was the big stress for the day. Let's adapt to that.
Right. And so I think this is a perfect time to kind of shift of what does doing less look like? How can I add in that rest, rejuvenation, and not make it feel like, oh, just like one more thing I need to add to my to-do list? What are some of kind of those easy go-tos of how to actually start managing that stress and simplify those to-dos?
Yeah. So kind of getting to a position of like, how can you,
like, how do you keep talking rest, rejuvenation. What do you mean when you say that? Like, what are we looking for?
Yeah. So when we are trying to maximize our results from a stimulus, we want to also maximize our recovery, right? And how we do that and how we can maybe spark up that process a little bit more, there's a few low-hanging fruits, but then there's also the individual approach as well. Right. Like there's some low-hanging fruits of, I can do some breathing drills where I'm focusing more on the exhale, getting longer exhales, holding more of an exhale, and kind of getting that vagus nerve to kind of reset, right? Get out of this position where it's ready to be heart rate and continuous and go, right? Letting it recognize like, oh, hey, we're exhaling, we're decompressing, like there's no tiger chasing us, right? Right. So there's not going to be any pill or medication out there that can lower your stress and your stress response faster than some good old breathing drills, right? So breathing drills is one. Super easy. You can do, YouTube box breathing, right? You do 5 minutes of some 555, 444, whatever box breathing you want to do. You can do one app that I'm really loving right now is Breathonics, right? They have some really cool power up breathing drills, some power down breathing drills, right?
I mean, even on most smartwatches, a thing will come up and say breathing. Like just as simple as that, you can do it while you're doing something else, but just being conscious of bringing your awareness to your breath.
Well, and because when we are stressing, a part of that stress response is typically that we stop breathing, right? Our body is preparing more internal energy storage and glucose, so we don't necessarily need as much oxygen, right? We don't need to breathe as much, so you're not breathing, right? So the sheer fact of your diaphragm not moving, you're closing up, right, is going to dump more adrenaline, right? Mm-hmm. So we want to get out of that response by sparking up some breathing, right? So breathing drills, super easy, super simple. For me, and it's not always the same for everyone, but getting into a cold shower, right?
Yes.
That is a big one.
I'm finally in there with you. I get it.
The big one for me is, when I'm hot, I've just gotten a workout in, I'm maybe irritable because I am hot and have trained and elicited this stress response. Getting into something cool gives me more of a sense of and relaxation, right? Breaking away from that adaptation, allowing the body to cool off, right? Because when we go into a rest and rejuvenation state, we're actually lowering our core temperature, right? When we sleep, the core temperature gets lower, so we can get in that deeper rest and rejuvenation. So if we've just done a lot of working out, we're also stressed from life, we're also the core temperature's raised, right? One way that we can do that, try to eliminate things, is lower things quicker, is lower our core temp, and then also get to breathing, right? Break that stress breathing, break that stress cycle of breathing, and get on to more of trying to elicit and get into that recovery state faster, right? Getting our heart rate variability back up, letting the core temperature go down so the body can start to recognize that it's not under attack. It doesn't need to keep being stressed, right?
Right.
But on that's a very objective way in the sense that there's a lot of good stuff out there. A lot of people know that. A lot of people know that you can do the breathing. You can do these, low-hanging fruits to lower that stress or break that stress cycle. But there's also the subjective, the things that you can do that instantly get you out of this stressful state, right? For me, it's either shooting my bow, it's hitting golf balls, right? It's one of these things that, if I'm in this stress cycle, my brain's turning into pretzel head, right? I'm like, well, there's no sense of me actually going and doing the thing that I know I need to do, because how I'm going to even be present in that thing is going to be shitty, right? So I'd rather delay that thing, go break that stress cycle, and then be in a more clairvoyant state where I'm not from this position of scarcity and fear and anger and irritability. I'm more in a state of joy, peace, happiness, excitement, right? Which is always going to bring better results from whatever you're putting it into, right? So, whether that's carrying it over into your family and how you treat your kids and your spouse and your coworkers, right? Not allowing yourself to be in that constant chronic stress is only going to it's not going to make you healthier. It's going to make relationships healthier. It's going to make your surroundings better. It's going to be how the emotions you attach to these experiences more positive, right? So, you're not, there's, we need some stress. We need some acute stress to tell the body, hey, fucking keep alive, right? Let's keep laying down tissue. Like you told me, like, man, I might need to go lift 300 pounds at any time. So shit, like I need to keep trying to lay down more bone density, more ligament density, more tendon density, right? We need that acute to make our body all-terrain and durable, right? But we also don't want chronic to the point where it's starting to deteriorate us internally, and it's starting to deteriorate our relationships and our surroundings and our associations with those surroundings, right? So that chronic stress can also become a very binary, I don't think that's the word I'm looking for, but a very a direct reflection of how the rest of your life is going on, right? Your health and how your body is healing. I've seen, I like to paint the example again to that client, right? Where you're like, I know inside you're not healthy, because your lipid and blood pressure panel say so, but it's because your body's not getting a chance to heal. And then it was a direct reflection of everything else in his life. Everything else in his life was chaos, right? So, it's a big part of all terrain, right? Is having, that internal stuff. We always want this internal piece and this physicality piece to be in alignment. So the mentality and clairvoyance is in alignment, because if the body's out of alignment, the brain is just not going to be thinking with clairvoyance. It's not going to be thinking and operating with clarity.
Right. Well, and I think you touched on something that's really important, and also like learning and understanding your own body cues and, you know, saying like this is something individual to all of us, and knowing and understanding like what may have brought your stress response down once and in one certain situation may not work again for the next situation. And so we kind of have to have looking at it as like a tool belt of all of these different strategies. It may not just be breathing. And I think it's also kind of giving the strategies in and of itself like their own little bit of grace of knowing and understanding like just because deep breaths and breathing didn't work one time doesn't mean it's not going to work another time. And knowing that you may need to try something else in this situation. Like I think one of the biggest things for you, and that comes up for a lot of people that isn't one of those like first common things on how to deal with stress. We usually think of like physical activity first. And I think also breaking away from the notion that physical activity needs to mean working out. But like you said, just getting up and moving, that could be moving into a cold shower, just like changing where you're working, going for a walk with the dogs, any sort of just kind of physical activity. It doesn't need to be a huge exertion of effort. But just kind of starting to move that way.
Well, it's muscle, right? Like you're kind of saying, like just because it didn't work this one time doesn't mean it's not going to work in the future, right? It is you taking time to prioritize de-stressing, and it's not, you know, when you want to do it the holistic way, it's not the easiest barrier of entry. It's not the thing that takes the least amount of resistance. It's not the quickest fix, right? It's not the thing that might be the most comfortable for you. You might have feelings of failing, like you're not doing the thing correctly, right? Where it could be much easier to pop the pill, right?
Yeah.
But when, you know, there's no medication that's going to override us prioritizing or keeping the things most essential to our survival in alignment first, right? Like, because as soon as you take that little Band-Aid away, you're still left with the root causes. Right? Like, cause those things are not in alignment, cause you're not prioritizing actually routinely de-stressing yourself and trying to work on a mental landscape that is less stressful, right? You are going to rip the Band-Aid off and still be left with the rotten core.
Well, and then when you also don't address that root cause is still growing.
Yep.
Like, you know, think of just putting the Band-Aid over on. Like, the wound isn't actually healing in and of itself. It's actually getting worse. And then we have to talk about, you know, increasing the dose of those things and just adding on more Band-Aids. And then that becomes a big stressor in and of itself. But I think, and you kind of touched on this just with saying like you like to go hit golf balls. You like to do all of these things. One of the biggest releases of stress, and it's something that I've personally had to like kind of reevaluate and rethink in my terms because I don't really consider myself a creative, quote unquote, person, but is doing something in a creative outlet. And I think that's one thing that you notice is a really, really big thing in your life is when you do find yourself kind of going into those constant states of stress is almost it's almost a form of adding in a good stress because, you know, you may be trying to learn something new or do something new. You're being creative in the process, and that creativity and that growth kind of gives you that positive feedback we were talking at the beginning of the episode of like, I know something good is coming out of this and there's like some sort of effect or a purpose to what I'm doing, even if it's not that quote unquote calming thing that we would think of.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that thing that allows you to formulate your thoughts, right? Allows you to do maybe deep work, allows you to be in a state where you're getting that passive movement, that, you know, not high impact movement where we know that our biggest sense of clarity comes from when we are eliciting some movement or some type of thing that's allowing, you know, it allows the brain to be in this kind of almost more alert, meditative, deep thought process, right? It's very similar as to like, you don't take an important phone call, typically sitting down, right? You take it standing up. You typically want to walk around. Like when it's something that's big news, you're like, you get the heck out of the room and you start pacing and you're waiting for this big news, right? And But inversely, same thing with our health and fitness, and maybe getting a position to break that stress cycle is getting that light passive movement to, where you're breathing and you're moving and you're not in this adrenaline dumped state and not breathing, you're clammed up. And then all of a sudden, now that you're getting into this rest and rejuvenation, you can view it from that different vantage point of more clairvoyance, more clarity, less stress, less feelings of scarcity and fear being presented because you are in that stressful state. So it's that thing that can allow just how we change the vantage point of what we're viewing that stress is going on. If we can do something that allows us to get into that creative flow, that creative, non-pressurized, creative think tank.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that leads us into, breaking it down to a little bit more of the health component, right? At All Terrain, there's a lot of things that we like to address when it comes to health and holistic position.
Right.
And one of the big bugaboos is the stressful eating, right? We get a lot of people coming to our group. If you're in our group, our Facebook group, or All Terrain Fitness Mentality group, right? You get pulled a question, what's the biggest thing you're struggling with? And so many people are like, stress eating, right? And
it's like, that's how I deal with stress.
Yeah.
Like, you're telling me I need to deal and manage stress. Gary, Hailey, this is what I do. I eat.
I go
to
the pantry. I go and get a little salty, crunchy munch with a little bit of sweet to follow. And then I'm in this back and forth of sweet and salty.
A whole thing of Oreos is gone. And I'm like, what the fuck just happened?
I had one Oreo. Okay, I had the whole box. So what we're going to do, post-show wrap-up, if you're listening to this audio or if you're on video, awesome. We're going to segue into it. We're going to go into how to break that stress eating response, how to, identify, bring awareness to what are these patterns, things that are causing me stress. And then when you are attaching that association of stress eating, can we replace that with something else that may elicit the same decompression response, but not get you to the point where you're also trying to cope with the stress with a thing that's making you lose your vitality and your health, right?
Right. Looking at more of a positive feedback loop instead of that negative feedback loop of you used food to try to decrease the stress, but now you feel guilty about it, which is causing you more stress. Like, let's find something else that is also decreasing the stress, but doesn't have that guilt and shame component on the far end.
Exactly. So in that, we're going to talk in our post-show wrap-ups. We're going to head to the good old whiteboard. We're going to talk about some things like changing our environment. We're going to talk about some cues you can do to bring awareness to when you're doing this bad habit and allowing it to be a muscle, again, that you're training, right? It's not something that you need to do these exercises for forever, but you need to bring the subconscious, you need to bring awareness to the subconscious of when you're doing that stress eating in those stressful moments.
Right.
And how can you get that subconscious to look for something else? How can I navigate and identify something else that, like, man, I need to do this right now. I need to go and do my breathing drills because I know this is going to help me thrive, right? It's so much of like, are we running on this survival or thriving axis, right? And getting the subconscious to recognize like, oh, this thing over here, let me start craving this because this is going to allow me to thrive, right?
Right.
Instead of you're in this kind of like fearful scarcity, let me go eat for this one little piece of comfort, right? And you get this blood sugar and you're kind of more in this survival mode where you're just trying to get by, right? Instead of allowing yourself to get to this position where you can also not be plaguing the physiology when you're trying to get out of that stress state.
Right. And your body's going to learn to crave those things, like you said, that allows you to thrive. You're not craving those quick fixes anymore. You're really your body's understanding like, oh, this is the actual fuel I need to
and for
actually
me,
make
right,
me do what I need to do.
How that came up present for me is like, there's something in me that says like, I need to go do breathing drills. It's not like it's something that I just magically want to do right off the top. It's not like something I did once and that I wanted to do, right?
Yeah.
It's becoming more deeply ingrained of like my subconscious brings awareness to like, I'm stressed out. This is not good. Like, I need to go and do some breathing drills. It's not that first association, that first thing that my body's looking for is like, all right, go take some time to meditate. Go take some time to breathe. Go take some time to hit some golf balls, shoot your bow, whatever it may be, right? Instead of, I have a new association, a new action attached to this emotional response, right? I have a new association attached to this stressful state, right? So you just don't want to be like Pavlov's dogs And every time you get stressed out, you start drooling,
Ding.
right? So let's attach something else to that is going to put us in a better state to thrive.
Right. And the more we do it, just like with other conditioning, the easier it's going to get.
Bam. Hey there, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the episode and took away some value that will amplify your life. But if you are ready to become an all-terrain human yourself, then click the link below to head over to our Facebook group to receive a copy of our all-terrain body blueprint, the 5 key pillars to a fast metabolism for life. These 5 pillars will show you how to speed up your metabolism at any age and eat for your specific metabolic needs so you can obtain your ideal composition without eliminating foods and spending all day in the gym. So if you're ready to reclaim your energy, vitality, and fire for life, then click the link below and head over to the All Terrain Fitness Mentality and Fat Loss Facebook group to pick up a copy of the All Terrain Body Blueprint, the 5 key pillars to a fast metabolism for life, and we will see you on the inside. We will head over to our post-show wrap-up of your listening audio, wherever you may be. Don't forget, you can always head to our All Terrain Fitness Mentality and Fat Loss group to receive your free copy of the All Terrain Body Blueprint. In there, we take you through the pillars of what it means to being an all-terrain human, and that's diving much more than the coolest, latest workout tips and tricks and hacks and eating a certain way. It is, what are these principles, these guiding principles that we can implement for the rest of our life that are going to allow us to keep our physiology and health in alignment in the easiest, most repeatable and sustainable way possible, right? It's the reason why a healthy lifestyle doesn't stick for people. It's not because you're technically doing something wrong. You haven't found the thing that is going to work well with you, but also aligned it with certain principles that are guaranteed to work, right? Like understanding what is your metabolic needs and how to eat for those, right? But how do you take that principle that works 100% of the time and align it with your life in a way that fits your boxes and your routine and your schedule? And that's what we do in the All Terrain Body Blueprint. Is we're not trying to pigeonhole people. We're say, hey, here are these archetypes, these principles you have to implement because it's proven, right? The data shows. But how do you take those principles and that science and construct boxes in your life that make sense for you? And once you can align those two things, you get an understanding of these principles that are always going to work, but also how to apply it in your life in a way that makes sense for you. Then you get into a position where you can create the all-terrain lifestyle.
Absolutely. So like Garry said, you can go ahead and find that All Terrain Body Blueprint in our Facebook group, All Terrain Fitness Mentality and Fat Loss. But for everyone listening, we just want to say thank you for taking the time listening to us chat about my favorite but not favorite thing, stress. And we're super excited to have you hop on over and listen to those actual concrete tips and tricks on how to break away from that stress eating. I've been there. I know a lot of other athletes have been there. So we're stoked for you to watch that.
Boom.